The black luxury car pulled into the driveway of a small house that looked completely out of place next to the mansion-sized properties David usually visited. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, staring at the peeling paint on the front door and the overgrown garden that his father had once kept so perfectly trimmed. 3 missed calls from Mrs. Johnson, the neighbor, had finally forced him to make this trip. She'd left worried messages about his father not answering his door for 2 days. David had been in back-to-back board meetings, closing a deal worth hundreds of millions when the calls came in. His first instinct was to send his assistant to check, but something in the elderly woman's voice made him reconsider. He hadn't spoken to his father in over 2 years. Their last conversation had ended in shouting, with his father calling him heartless and David storming out after another failed attempt to convince the stubborn old man to move into a luxury care facility. His father had thrown the brochures in the trash and told David that money couldn't buy everything, especially not forgiveness for abandoning family values. Walking up the cracked pathway, David noticed the lawn had been recently mowed, which seemed odd if his father was having problems. The small garden by the front steps was filled with colorful flowers that definitely hadn't been there during his last visit. Someone had been taking care of the place. He pulled out the spare key his father never knew he'd kept and quietly opened the front door. The smell hit him immediately, not the musty, closed-up smell he'd expected, but something warm and inviting. Fresh bread maybe and coffee. The house felt alive in a way it hadn't since his mother died 5 years ago. Soft music was playing from the living room. Classical music, his father's favorite, though David couldn't remember the last time he'd heard it playing in this house. He moved quietly down the hallway, past family photos that brought back memories he'd tried to forget. Photos of birthdays, graduations, family vacations from when things were simpler, and money hadn't yet driven a wedge between them. The sound of gentle voices made him stop just outside the living room doorway. Through the crack he could see his father sitting in a wheelchair he didn't know existed. When had that happened? His father looked smaller than David remembered, frailer, but there was something different about his expression. A woman was sitting beside him, carefully spooning soup into his mouth with the patience of a saint. She looked to be in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore scrubs, the kind nurses wear, and moved with the gentle efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. "There you go, Mr. Robert," she said softly, wiping a small spill from his chin with a napkin. "This soup will help you get stronger. My grandmother used to make it just like this when I was sick as a child." David's father made a sound that might have been trying to say something. The woman leaned closer, listening carefully as if his mumbled words were the most important thing in the world. "You want to hear about the flowers again?" she asked with a smile. "Of course. Well, the roses by your front step are blooming beautifully. The red ones are your favorites, you told me, and Mrs. Johnson from next door brought over some tomatoes from her garden. She says to tell you they're the best ones yet this season." David watched in amazement as his father's face lit up with something he hadn't seen in years. Genuine happiness. The woman continued talking, describing the neighborhood, the weather, small details about the day that somehow seemed to matter tremendously in this quiet room. She reached for a photo album from the side table and opened it carefully. "Should we look at some pictures while you finish your soup?" she asked. "I love hearing the stories about when David was little." David felt his chest tighten at the mention of his name. He leaned closer to the doorway, careful not to be seen. "This one here," the woman said, pointing to a picture David remembered well. "You said this was when he won the science fair in 4th grade. Look how proud you both look. And here's his mother with that beautiful smile." You can see where David gets his determination from. There was no bitterness in her voice when she spoke about him. No judgment. Just simple observations about a family she'd only known through photos and his father's stories. His father made another sound, and the woman nodded as if she understood perfectly. "Yes, you're right. Children grow up and sometimes they forget what really matters. But love doesn't disappear, does it? It just gets buried under other things sometimes." David found himself holding his breath. How could this stranger understand his father better than he did? How could she speak so easily about things that had been too painful for him to even think about? The woman stood up slowly and walked to the window, adjusting the curtains to let in more light. "The sun is perfect today," she said. "Not too bright, just warm and gentle. Would you like me to open the window a little so you can hear the birds?" She moved around the room with quiet grace, straightening pillows, adjusting his father's blanket, checking that everything was comfortable. but it wasn't the mechanical care of a paid professional. There was something deeper here, something that reminded David of how his mother used to fuss over his father when he was sick. "Maria brought her grandson by yesterday while you were napping," the woman continued, returning to her chair. "Little Carlos. He's learning to ride a bike and he wanted to show you, but we didn't want to wake you. Maybe tomorrow he can demonstrate his skills." David realized that his father had a whole life here that he knew nothing about. Neighbors who cared, this woman who clearly devoted herself to his well-being, daily routines that brought joy to what David had assumed were lonely, difficult days. His father tried to speak again, and this time David could make out a few words. "Thank you, Rosa, Rosa." The woman's name was Rosa, and she responded to his father's gratitude with the kind of warmth that couldn't be faked or bought. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Robert," she said gently. "Taking care of you isn't work. It's a privilege. You've taught me so much about grace and strength. Even when things are difficult, you never complain. You just find something to be grateful for." David felt something crack inside his chest. When was the last time he'd felt grateful for anything? When was the last time he'd done something that wasn't ultimately about money or success or proving himself right? Rosa stood up and began cleaning up the lunch dishes. "I'll be right back," she told his father. "Then we can work on those exercises the physical therapist showed us. Your arm is getting stronger every day." As she moved toward the kitchen, David quickly stepped back into the hallway, his heart pounding. He wasn't ready to be discovered yet. He needed time to process what he'd just witnessed, to understand how everything he thought he knew about his father's situation had been completely wrong. From the kitchen came the sound of running water and the gentle clinking of dishes. Rosa was humming softly, the same classical melody that had been playing when he arrived. The whole house seemed to breathe with contentment, a peace that David couldn't remember ever feeling in his own multi-million-dollar penthouse. He looked back toward the living room, where his father sat quietly in his wheelchair, but there was nothing quiet about the life that had been built around him. This wasn't the tragedy David had imagined. This was something else entirely, something that challenged everything he thought he understood about what made life worth living. David stood in the hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to make sense of what he'd just seen. The sound of Rosa returning from the kitchen made him realize he couldn't hide forever. He took a deep breath and stepped into the living room. Rosa looked up in surprise, nearly dropping the small towel she was carrying. Her hand went to her chest, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I'm sorry," David said quickly. "I didn't mean to startle you. I'm David, Robert's son." Recognition flickered in Rosa's eyes, followed by something that might have been concern. She glanced toward his father, who had turned his head at the sound of voices and was now staring at David with an expression that was difficult to read. "Mr. David," Rosa said carefully, setting down the towel, "your father has told me about you. I'm Rosa Martinez. I helped take care of him." There was no warmth in her greeting, but no hostility either, just professional politeness, as if she was waiting to see what kind of person he really was before deciding how to treat him. David looked at his father, who seemed smaller and more fragile than ever in his wheelchair. "Dad," he said, the word feeling strange after so much silence between them. "I got a call from Mrs. Johnson. She was worried." His father made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it was hard to tell. Rosa moved closer to him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and comforting. "He's been fine," Rosa said, her voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Johnson worries because she doesn't see him outside as much since the stroke, but he's doing well. We have a routine." "Stroke?" David felt the word hit him like a physical blow. "When? Why didn't anyone call me?" Rosa and his father exchanged a look that seemed to carry an entire conversation. Finally, Rosa spoke. "It was 6 months ago. Your father specifically asked that you not be contacted. He said you had more important things to worry about." The words stung because they sounded exactly like something his father would say. David had made it clear over the years that his business came first, that family obligations were interruptions he couldn't afford. Now those priorities felt like stones in his stomach. "I would have come," David said, though even as he said it, he wondered if it was true. 6 months ago, he'd been in the middle of acquiring a tech startup. He probably would have sent money for private care and visited when it was convenient. "Your father is a proud man," Rosa said simply, He didn't want to be a burden. David looked around the room, really seeing it for the first time. The house was immaculate, but more than that, it felt loved. There were fresh flowers on every surface. Family photos had been cleaned and reorganized, and everything had been arranged for his father's comfort and mobility. "How long have you been taking care of him?" David asked. 8 months, Rosa replied. "I started just before the stroke, when he needed help with basic things. After the stroke, the care agency increased my hours. And you're here every day?" Rosa hesitated before answering.
"The agency schedules me for 5 days a week."
"But I come on weekends too sometimes. Mr. Robert shouldn't be alone." Something in her tone made David suspicious. "The agency doesn't pay you for weekends." "No," Rosa admitted. "But that's not important." David felt his business instincts kicking in. People didn't work for free, especially not for strangers. There had to be an angle. Some way she was benefiting from this arrangement. Maybe she was stealing or manipulating his father somehow. "What do you get out of it?" he asked bluntly. Rosa's face flushed slightly and she stood up straighter. "I get the satisfaction of knowing that a good man is being cared for properly." "Come on," David said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Nobody works for free. What's really going on here?" His father made a sound that was clearly distressed, and Rosa immediately turned her attention to him, speaking softly in Spanish before switching back to English. "It's okay, Mr. Robert, everything is fine." But everything wasn't fine. David could see that his father was agitated, trying to say something that wasn't coming out clearly. Rosa leaned down, listening patiently as he struggled with words that seemed to get tangled before they reached his mouth. Finally, Rosa straightened up and looked at David with something that might have been pity. "Your father wants to tell you something, but it's hard for him to speak sometimes. Would you like me to explain?" David nodded, feeling suddenly like a child who was about to be told something he wasn't going to like. "Mr. Robert has been helping my family," Rosa said quietly. "My son Carlos is sick. He has leukemia. The treatments are expensive and our insurance doesn't cover everything. Your father found out when I had to leave work early for doctor appointments, and he insisted on helping with the medical bills." David stared at her, then at his father, who was nodding slowly despite the effort it clearly took. "That's impossible," David said. "My father lives on Social Security and a small pension. He doesn't have money for medical bills." Rosa walked to a small desk in the corner and returned with a folder. She opened it and showed David a stack of receipts and payment confirmations. He's been using his savings, and when that ran out, he started selling things. David looked through the papers with growing shock. There were receipts for thousands of dollars in medical payments, all in his father's name. At the bottom of the stack was a receipt from a jewelry store for his mother's ring, the one his father had refused to let David buy back for him when money got tight. "He sold Mom's ring?" David whispered. "And his coin collection," Rosa said. "And the watch your grandfather gave him. He said they were just things and Carlos needed help more than he needed things." David felt the room spinning slightly. His father, who had refused every offer of financial help, who had turned down luxury care facilities and expensive medical treatments for himself, had bankrupted himself to help a stranger's child. "I tried to stop him," Rosa continued. "I told him it was too much, that we would find another way. But he wouldn't listen. He said that money sitting in a bank account wasn't helping anyone, but Carlos needed help right now." "Where's Carlos now?" David asked, his voice barely audible. "He's in the hospital," Rosa said. "He needs surgery next week, but we're still short on the payments. I've been working extra shifts at my other jobs, trying to make up the difference, but—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. David could do the math. Even working around the clock, there was no way Rosa could earn enough to cover advanced cancer treatments. His father made another sound, and Rosa immediately went to him. This time David could make out a few words clearly. "Good boy. Carlos. Brave." "Your father talks about Carlos all the time," Rosa said. "He calls him his honorary grandson. Carlos doesn't understand why a stranger would help him, but your father says that's what family does for each other." David felt something break inside his chest. His father, who had been so disappointed in his real son's choices, had found a way to be a grandfather to a child who needed him, and he was giving everything he had to do it. "I don't understand," David said. "Why didn't you just ask me for the money? If you knew who I was, if you knew I could afford it, why go through all this?" Rosa looked at him with genuine surprise. "Ask you for money, Mr. David? I've never asked anyone for money in my life, and your father would never forgive me if I used his situation to ask his son for help. He's proud of his independence even now. But you're both suffering because of it, David said. This doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense, Rosa replied. Your father isn't suffering. He's doing what makes him happy. Helping Carlos gives him purpose. Taking away someone's purpose, even to make their life easier, isn't actually helping them. David looked at his father, who was watching him with those keen eyes that had always seen through every excuse and rationalization. Even weakened by stroke, even struggling to speak, his father was still teaching him lessons he wasn't sure he was ready to learn. How much do you need? David asked finally. For the surgery, Rosa shook her head. We'll find a way. We always do. That's not what I asked, David said. How much? Mr. David, Rosa said firmly. Your father would be very upset if he thought I was asking you for money. That's not why I told you about Carlos. Then why did you tell me? Rosa was quiet for a long moment, looking between David and his father. Because your father loves you, she said finally. And he wanted you to understand that he's not sad or lonely or forgotten. He has purpose. He has people who care about him. He has a life that means something. David felt tears threatening for the first time in years. His father hadn't told him about Carlos to ask for help. He'd told him to prove that even in his weakened state, even living in a small house with peeling paint, he was still the man who had raised David to believe that character mattered more than money. The question was, what was David going to do with that lesson? David couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his king-sized bed in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling and thinking about his father in a wheelchair, giving away everything he owned to help a sick child he'd only known for a few months. The contrast between their lives felt like a chasm he didn't know how to cross. The next morning, instead of heading to his office, David found himself driving back to his father's house. He told himself he was just checking on things, making sure everything was okay, but the truth was that he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed the day before. Rosa answered the door, looking surprised to see him again so soon. Mr. David, she said, is everything all right? I just wanted to see how he's doing, David said, feeling awkward. If that's okay. Rosa stepped aside to let him in. Of course. He's in the living room. We were just finishing breakfast. David followed her into the living room, where his father was sitting in his wheelchair by the window, looking out at the garden. There was a plate with toast crumbs on the side table, and the morning news was playing softly on an old television that David remembered from his childhood. Dad, David said, taking a seat in the chair Rosa had vacated. How are you feeling today? His father turned to look at him, and David saw something that might have been surprise or maybe pleasure in his eyes. He made a sound that Rosa seemed to understand immediately. He's asking if you're staying for a while, Rosa translated. I can make more coffee if you'd like. That would be nice, David said, then looked at his father. I don't have any meetings today. I thought maybe we could spend some time together. Rosa disappeared into the kitchen, leaving David alone with his father for the first time in years. The silence felt heavy at first, but gradually David began to relax. His father wasn't demanding explanations or apologies. He was just present, looking out at the garden where a few birds were pecking at seeds someone had scattered on the ground. Rosa told me about Carlos, David said finally, about what you've been doing to help him. His father's attention shifted to David, and he could see the older man trying to form words. Finally, he managed to say, Good boy. I'm sure he is, David agreed. Rosa seems to think a lot of you too. She talks about you like your family. His father smiled, a real smile that transformed his whole face. He reached over with his good hand and patted David's arm, then pointed toward the kitchen where Rosa was moving around quietly. Angel, his father said clearly. David felt his throat tighten. His father thought Rosa was an angel, and maybe she was. How else could you explain someone who worked without pay, who brought homemade meals to share, who treated a stroke patient with the tenderness of a daughter? Rosa returned with coffee and settled back into her routine. David watched as she helped his father with physical therapy exercises, encouraging him with gentle words and celebrating small improvements as if they were major victories. She read to him from the newspaper, pausing to explain complicated stories and asking his opinion on local politics. What do you think about the new traffic light they're putting in downtown? Rosa asked, showing his father a picture in the local paper. Mrs. Johnson thinks it's about time. She says too many people speed through that intersection. David's father made a sound that was clearly agreement, then looked toward David. Rosa noticed the look and smiled. Mr. Robert remembers when you had your first car accident at that intersection, she said to David. He says you were 16 and trying to impress a girl named Jennifer. You remember that? David asked his father, amazed. It had been a minor fender bender, nothing serious, but his father had used it as a teaching moment about responsibility and the importance of paying attention while driving. His father nodded, then struggled to speak again. Proud of you then. The word then hung in the air between them. Proud of him then, but what about now? David wanted to ask, but he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. Over the following days, David found himself returning to the house again and again. He told himself it was just to check on his father's condition, but the truth was more complicated. There was something peaceful about the small house, something real that was missing from his usual life. He began to see the rhythms of his father's days. Morning exercises with Rosa, lunch by the window while she read to him, afternoon visits from neighbors, who had become genuine friends. Mrs. Johnson stopped by with vegetables from her garden. Mr. Patterson from across the street came over to watch baseball games and provide commentary that made his father laugh. David realized his father had built a community around himself, something David had never managed despite all his wealth and connections. His relationships were all business-related, based on what people could do for each other rather than genuine care. One afternoon, Rosa's phone rang while she was helping his father with exercises. David could hear the worry in her voice as she spoke rapidly in Spanish. When she hung up, her hands were shaking. What's wrong? David asked. That was the hospital, Rosa said, sinking into a chair. Carlos has developed an infection. They want to do the surgery earlier than planned, but they need a larger deposit before they'll proceed. David's father immediately became agitated, trying to speak but getting frustrated when the words wouldn't come. Rosa went to him, speaking softly in both English and Spanish, trying to calm him down. How much do you need? David asked. Rosa shook her head. We'll figure something out. We always do. That's not an answer, David said. How much? $15,000, Rosa said quietly. By tomorrow morning. David pulled out his phone, ready to make a transfer, but Rosa stopped him. Mr. David, please. I can't let you do that. Why not? It's just money. It's not just money to us, Rosa said firmly. It's our dignity. If I take money from you, then I'm not taking care of your father because I care about him. I'm doing it because I owe you something. David looked at his father, who was nodding despite his obvious worry about Carlos. Even facing the possibility that the boy might not get the surgery he needed, his father supported Rosa's decision to maintain her independence. Then what if it's not charity? David said. What if I hire you, not just to take care of my father, but to help me understand how to do this right? I don't know how to take care of anyone. I don't know how to be part of a community like this. Maybe you could teach me. Rosa looked suspicious. Teach you what? How to be the kind of person who puts people before profit, David said. How to find meaning in something other than the next deal or the next acquisition. How to be someone my father could be proud of again. His father made a sound, and when David looked at him, he saw tears in the older man's eyes. His father reached out with his good hand, and David took it, feeling the calluses from years of honest work. I don't know if I can change, David said to both of them. I've been focused on money and success for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to care about anything else. But watching you with him, seeing what real kindness looks like, maybe there's hope for me. Rosa was quiet for a long moment, studying David's face as if trying to determine whether he was sincere. If I accept your help, she said finally, it's not because I'm taking charity. It's because I believe your father wants his son back, and maybe helping Carlos is a way for all of us to find what we're looking for. David nodded, understanding that this was about more than money. It was about redemption, about second chances, about learning that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, but had to be earned through genuine care for others. That evening, after Rosa left for the hospital to be with Carlos, David sat with his father in the quiet living room. The old man dozed fitfully in his wheelchair, but every now and then he'd wake up and look toward the door, clearly worried about the boy he'd come to love. "I'm going to fix this, Dad," David said quietly, "and then maybe you can teach me how to be the kind of man who deserves to be called your son." His father's eyes opened, and for a moment, they looked at each other with an understanding that had been missing for years. His father squeezed David's hand with surprising strength, and David knew that this was where his real education was about to begin. David spent the entire night making phone calls. Not to his usual business contacts, but to doctors, hospitals, and medical specialists. By morning, he had arranged for Carlos to be transferred to the best children's hospital in the state, with a team of specialists who were excited to take on his case. When Rosa arrived at his father's house the next morning, her eyes were red from crying and lack of sleep. She looked exhausted and worried, carrying the weight of impossible decisions on her shoulders. "Rosa," David said gently, "I need to tell you something about Carlos." Her face went pale. "Is he worse?" "The infection?" "No," David said quickly. "He's fine. Better than fine, actually. I've arranged for him to be treated at Children's Medical Center. The best pediatric cancer team in the region is taking over his care, and they're optimistic about his prognosis." Rosa stared at him, not understanding. "But the money mine is taken care of," David said. "Completely. No bills, no debt, no worries about insurance coverage. Everything is handled." Rosa sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "Mr. David, I told you we couldn't accept charity." "It's not charity," David said, sitting down across from her. "I have a proposition for you. I want to start a foundation and I want you to run it." "A foundation?" David looked toward his father, who was listening intently despite his physical limitations. "A foundation that helps families like yours. Families dealing with medical emergencies who can't afford the care they need. But here's the thing, I don't know how to do this right. I don't know how to help people without taking away their dignity." "You do?" Rosa looked confused. "I don't understand. You've been taking care of my father not because you had to, but because you wanted to. You've been working without pay because you saw someone who needed help. You've maintained your pride and your independence even when things got difficult. Those are skills I don't have. Those are qualities I need to learn." David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Rosa had helped his father maintain. "I've spent my whole life acquiring things. Companies, properties, investments. But I've never actually built anything that mattered. I want this foundation to matter." "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Rosa said. "I'm asking you to teach me how to help people the right way," David said. "I'm asking you to help me create something that honors what my father taught me about character and integrity. And I'm asking you to let me pay you a salary that reflects the value of what you'll be doing." Rosa was quiet for a long time, processing what he was saying. Finally, she looked toward his father. "What do you think, Mr. Robert? Should I trust your son?" David's father struggled to speak but finally managed a few clear words. "Good heart, like mother." Rosa smiled, the first genuine smile David had seen from her since they'd met. "Your father thinks you have your mother's heart underneath all that business armor." "I hope he's right," David said. "I'm not sure anymore who I am when I'm not making deals and accumulating wealth. Maybe this is a chance to find out." Over the next few weeks, David found himself spending more and more time at his father's house. He started arriving in the mornings, helping with breakfast and morning exercises. He learned to read his father's expressions, to understand his limited speech, to anticipate his needs. It wasn't easy. David was used to controlling every situation, but caring for someone else required patience and humility he'd never developed. The first time he tried to help his father with physical therapy, he was too aggressive, too focused on results rather than comfort. Rosa had to gently correct him, showing him how to encourage without pushing, how to celebrate small progress instead of demanding dramatic improvement. "It's not about fixing him," Rosa explained as they worked together to help his father move from his wheelchair to his favorite armchair. "It's about helping him be the best version of himself he can be right now." David began to understand that this applied to more than just physical therapy. His father didn't need to be fixed or changed or improved. He needed to be respected and loved exactly as he was. As Carlos began his treatment at the new hospital, David found himself visiting regularly. The 10-year-old boy was brave in a way that humbled David completely. Despite being sick and scared, Carlos worried more about his mother working too hard than he did about his own condition. "Is my mom sad because I'm sick?" Carlos asked David during one visit. "Your mom is worried because she loves you," David explained. But she's not sad. She's proud of how brave you're being. Mr. Robert says being brave doesn't mean not being scared, Carlos said. It means doing what you have to do even when you are scared. David realized his father had been teaching Carlos the same lessons he'd tried to teach David years ago. The difference was that Carlos was listening. The foundation took shape slowly, with Rosa's guidance keeping David grounded in reality. She insisted they start small, with local families, learning how to help effectively before expanding. She created systems that preserved dignity while providing assistance, programs that empowered people rather than creating dependency. It's not about writing checks, Rosa explained as they reviewed applications from families needing help. It's about understanding what people really need and finding ways to provide it that make them stronger, not weaker. David learned to listen to stories instead of just looking at numbers. He met families who were struggling with medical bills, parents who were working multiple jobs to afford treatments, children who were growing up too fast because of illness in the family. Each story taught him something new about resilience, about love, about what really mattered in life. One evening, as David was helping his father get ready for bed, the older man grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Proud," his father said clearly. "Proud of you." David felt tears spring to his eyes. "I'm trying, Dad. I'm trying to be the person you and Mom raised me to be." His father nodded, then struggled to say something else. "Never. Too late." Rosa, who had been quietly organizing medications nearby, smiled. "He's been saying that a lot lately. Never too late to become who you're supposed to be." David realized that his father hadn't given up on him, even during all those years of silence and disappointment. He'd been waiting, hoping that someday his son would remember what he'd been taught about kindness and integrity and community. As the weeks passed, David found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. He started arriving at work later, leaving earlier. He delegated more responsibilities to his staff, trusting them to handle things that had once seemed to require his personal attention. He discovered that the world didn't end when he wasn't available every moment of every day. His assistant noticed the change first. "You seem different," she said one afternoon when David declined a meeting that would have conflicted with his father's physical therapy appointment. "Different how?" David asked. "Calmer," she said. "Like you're not carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders anymore." David thought about that conversation as he drove to his father's house that evening. Maybe the weight he'd been carrying wasn't the responsibility of running a company, but the burden of living a life that didn't align with his values. Maybe success meant something entirely different than he'd believed. When he arrived at the house, he found Rosa and his father looking at photo albums again. But this time there were new pictures mixed in with the old ones. Pictures of Carlos in his hospital bed, smiling despite his condition. Pictures of David helping his father with exercises. Pictures of the three of them sharing meals around the small kitchen table. "We're making new memories," Rosa said, noticing David looking at the photos. "Your father wanted to document this time when his family came back together." David sat down beside his father and looked at the pictures of their new life. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was fuller and richer than anything he'd built with all his wealth and ambition. "Thank you," he said to Rosa, "for taking care of him, for teaching me how to take care of him, for showing me what really matters." Rosa patted his hand. "Thank you for remembering who you are underneath all that success. Your father never stopped believing you'd find your way back." As David looked at his father, he saw not a sick old man in a wheelchair, but a teacher who had finally succeeded in passing on his most important lesson. It had just taken longer than either of them had expected. 3 months later, David stood in the lobby of Children's Medical Center, holding a small wrapped gift and feeling more nervous than he had before any business presentation in his life. Today was the day Carlos would finally go home, completely cancer-free, and David had arranged a surprise that he hoped would bring joy to everyone who had become so important to him. The elevator ride to Carlos's floor felt endless. David had spent weeks planning this moment, working with Rosa and the hospital staff to coordinate everything perfectly. But now that it was happening, he wondered if he was doing the right thing, if his gesture would be received the way he intended. Carlos's room was filled with balloons and flowers, gifts from nurses and doctors who had fallen in love with the brave little boy over the months of his treatment. When David walked in, Carlos was sitting up in bed looking healthier than David had ever seen him, his hair starting to grow back in soft dark curls. "Mr. David," Carlos called out, his face lighting up with genuine happiness. "Did you come to see me go home?" "I wouldn't miss it," David said, setting down his gift and giving Carlos a careful hug. "How are you feeling?" "Strong," Carlos said, flexing his thin arm. "The doctors say I'm going to be okay forever now. And Mom says I can go back to school next month." Rosa was packing Carlos's belongings into a small suitcase, but David could see the tears of joy in her eyes. The past few months had been difficult, but they had all made it through together. "I have something for you," David said, handing Carlos the wrapped package. "But first I need to tell you something important." Carlos carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a framed photograph of him sitting with David's father in the garden behind the house. In the photo, both of them were smiling, and his father's hand was resting on Carlos's shoulder in a gesture of pure grandfatherly love. "Mr. Robert wanted to be here today," David said, "but the trip would be too hard for him. So he asked me to give you this and to tell you something special." Carlos studied the photo, tracing his finger along the edge of the frame. "What did he want to tell me?" David knelt down beside the hospital bed, bringing himself to Carlos's eye level. "He wanted to tell you that you're the bravest person he's ever known, and he wanted to ask you if you'd like to be his official grandson." Carlos's eyes went wide. "Really? He wants to adopt me?" "Not legally," David explained quickly, seeing Rosa's concerned expression. "You already have the best mom in the world. But he wants you to be part of our family. He wants to be your grandfather by choice." Carlos looked at Rosa, who was crying openly now. "Mom, can I have a grandfather?" "Oh, sweetheart," Rosa said, sitting on the edge of the bed and pulling Carlos into a gentle hug. "If that's what you want, then yes. Mr. Robert has been like family to us for months now." Carlos turned back to David, his expression serious despite his young age. "Does this mean you're like my uncle?" David felt his throat tighten with emotion. "If you'd like me to be. I would like that," Carlos said solemnly. "But I have to warn you, I'm not very good at business stuff. I'm better at dinosaurs and soccer." David laughed, the sound coming from somewhere deep in his chest. "Lucky for you, I'm trying to get better at things besides business. Maybe you can teach me about dinosaurs." An hour later, they arrived at David's father's house to find the front yard decorated with welcome home banners and filled with neighbors who had been following Carlos's progress throughout his treatment. Mrs. Johnson had organized a small celebration, and even Mr. Patterson had brought his famous homemade ice cream. But the real surprise was waiting inside. David had spent the past month quietly transforming the small house, making it fully accessible for his father while adding a special room for Carlos. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was designed specifically for a 10-year-old boy who loved dinosaurs and needed a place to call home when he visited his new grandfather. "This is for me?" Carlos asked, standing in the doorway of his new room, taking in the dinosaur decorations and the small desk where he could do homework. "Your mom is moving into the house next door," David explained. "I bought it so you could be close to your grandfather, Robert, but you'll still live with your mom like always." Rosa gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. David had told her about the house, but seeing it in person, knowing it was really theirs, was overwhelming. "David," she whispered, "this is too much." "It's not too much," David said firmly. "It's exactly right. You're running a foundation that's helping hundreds of families now. Carlos needs stability while he recovers, and my father needs his family close by. This isn't charity, Rosa. This is family taking care of family." They found David's father in the living room, looking more alert and healthy than he had in months. The excitement of having Carlos and Rosa nearby had given him new energy, and he'd been working extra hard in physical therapy to be ready for this day. "Grandfather Robert," Carlos called out, running to the wheelchair and carefully hugging the man who had become so important to him. David's father managed to say, "Carlos," clearly, his face shining with happiness. He had been practicing the boy's name for weeks, determined to say it perfectly on this important day. What happened next left everyone in the room speechless. David's father, with Rosa's help, slowly stood up from his wheelchair. He had been working in secret with his physical therapist, determined to be standing when Carlos came home. It was only for a few seconds, and he needed Rosa's support, but he was upright, looking down at Carlos with tears of joy streaming down his face. "Grandfather," Carlos whispered, understanding the significance of the moment even at his young age. The room fell completely silent except for the sound of quiet crying. Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Patterson, and several other neighbors watched as 3 generations of an unconventional family embraced, surrounded by people who had chosen to care about each other. David felt his father's hand grip his arm with surprising strength. The older man looked up at him and spoke more clearly than he had in months. "This is what wealth looks like." Rosa wiped tears from her eyes and looked around the room at the faces of people who had become her chosen family. "6 months ago, I was just trying to keep my son alive and pay my bills. Now look at us. What do you see?" David asked softly. "I see what happens when people choose love over fear," Rosa said. "When they choose generosity over selfishness. When they remember that we're all connected." Later that evening, after the neighbors had gone home and Carlos had fallen asleep in his new room, David sat with his father and Rosa in the quiet living room. The foundation they had built together was thriving, helping families across the state. Carlos was healthy and happy, with a future full of possibilities. And David had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. "I have an announcement to make," David said, looking at both of them. "I've decided to step back from the day-to-day operations of my company. I want to focus on the foundation full-time, and on being the kind of son and uncle and friend that you both deserve." His father reached over and squeezed David's hand, his eyes bright with pride and satisfaction. "Are you sure?" Rosa asked. "Running a company like yours will be fine without me," David finished. "I've got good people in place, and I've discovered that there are more important things than quarterly profits and market share. I've discovered that the real measure of success isn't what you accumulate, but what you give away. And not just money, time, attention, love, presence." 6 months later, David stood in front of a room full of reporters and community leaders, announcing the expansion of the Robert Martinez Foundation to 3 new states. Rosa stood beside him, confident and professional in her role as executive director, while Carlos sat in the front row next to his grandfather, Robert, both of them beaming with pride. "This foundation exists because of one simple truth," David told the audience. "Real wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the relationships we build, the people we help, and the love we share. My father taught me that lesson, but it took a remarkable woman named Rosa Martinez and her incredible son Carlos to help me understand what it really meant." The applause was thunderous, but David barely heard it. He was looking at his father, who was sitting straighter than he had in years, his face glowing with the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing your most important work finally come to fruition. After the press conference, as they drove home together, Carlos asked David a question that would stay with him forever. "Uncle David, why do you think it took so long for you to remember what Grandfather Robert taught you when you were little?" David thought about the question seriously before answering. "I think sometimes when we're trying so hard to succeed, we forget what success really means. I was so busy trying to make my father proud by becoming rich that I forgot he was already proud of me, for who I was inside." "That's kind of silly," Carlos said with the wisdom of childhood. "Yes," David agreed, laughing. "It really was." As they pulled into the driveway of the small house that had become the center of their world, David realized that his life had become something he never could have planned or purchased. It was messy and complicated and required daily work, but it was also filled with a richness that no amount of money could have bought. Rosa helped his father out of the car while Carlos ran ahead to open the front door. Standing there in the fading light of evening, surrounded by the family he had found rather than the one he had been born into, David finally understood what his father had been trying to teach him all along. The greatest fortune isn't what you earn, it's what you learn to give away freely, knowing that in the giving you receive something far more valuable than anything you could ever buy.